So let's go ahead then and get started. My name is Sean, and I'm a member of Workers' Voice from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm also a public school educator, and I've been involved in a coalition of educators working on the issue of around the campaign of Stop Cop City. And I want to welcome you all to our monthly Workers' Voice panel, this one which will be on the question of Stop Cop City, addressing the issue of environmental racism, as well as bringing in an international perspective. Activists and community members have resoundingly stated that there is broad opposition to the construction of what would be one of the United States' largest police training facilities on the ashes of the Weelaunee Forest in Atlanta. This site has been dubbed Cop City, and the training center would be right next to multiple working class and predominantly Black neighborhoods. The campaign to stop Cop City, like many other environmental fights that have cropped up, is not just a struggle against climate destruction, but also against racism, colonialism, and police violence. Here today with us, we have working class and socialist activists from across the United States and in Brazil to discuss this campaign, as well as the broader fight against environmental racism and colonialism. So here today with us, we have Sankara Lumumba, who is a member of the group Community Movement Builders and an Atlanta native. We have Fiona Mack with us, who is a member of the DSA Connecticut Eco-Socialist Working Group and has been involved in Stop Cop City solidarity work. We have Kolo Wamba, a member of AFT 1493 Executive Committee and member of Workers' Voice out in the Bay Area. And we also have the pleasure of welcoming one of our international comrades, Wilson Honorio da Silva, from the Partido Socialista dos Trabajadores Unificado from Brazil, to help bring in an international perspective to this fight and the struggles against environmental racism, environmental degradation and destruction, and their relationship to imperialism and colonialism. So with that being said, we're going to start with some remarks from our panelists. We'll go in the order that I just introduced folks in, just to make it easy. Once we are done with that, we will have a question and answer session. I'm anticipating that comrades' comments from the panel should be somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes. And we'll then hopefully have around an hour to have discussion from the floor. We have both a Q&A and chat feature, as well as we have the ability to allow you guys to actually, speak from the floor as well. So we'll be utilizing that as well. And we'll explain it more as we go on. If you need Spanish translation, there is a button at the bottom with a little globe that says interpretation under it. And if you click there and click on Spanish, we are providing Spanish translation tonight. Si necesitas interpretación a español, empuja el botón que tiene un globo y dice interpretación y empuja lo que dice español. All right, with that being said, I'll go ahead and hand things over to our first speaker, Sankara.
All right, my name is Sankara, member of Community Movement Builders. So basically, I'll just kind of express CMB's kind of point of view concerning, Cop City. So, the idea of Cop City emerged immediately after the national uprisings in 22 in Atlanta. Community movement builders and other folks were mobilized around the police murder of Rayshard Brooks. He was murdered by the police at a Wendy's in, south side of Atlanta. And so while we were calling for divesting from police and having community control over public safety and investing in alternatives that enhance public safety, the corporate establishment and political Black misleadership of the city of Atlanta started planning the $90 million complex to demonstrate their commitment to police, to basically develop as a tactical site that could stop mass movements and continue the harassment of Black, poor, and working class communities. And so these institutions work with corporate media to shift the public narrative from police violence to focus more on, crime, where kind of the police are centered as the solution to all of our problems. So once the plans to build Cop City became known, so CMB and other organizations and allies decided to inform the public about Cop City, and there was a movement to stop Cop City that emerged kind of around this time. So you have like Defend the Forest and different coalitions and different groups of folks who started to think about planning to basically stop Cop City. And so we were able to demonstrate that public opinion was against it. Calls to the city hall on the night of the vote to lease the public forest to the Atlanta Police Foundation show about 70% of Atlanta was opposed to Cop City. But of course, the city council and the mayor moved forward. In June of 2021, folks, met with officials with no avail. And so the movement, started holding rallies. Community Movement Builders has held a couple of rallies outside of corporations that fund APF, including organizations like AT&T, Coca-Cola. And that's, certain demonstrations, people were pepper sprayed, attacked, and arrested by police, even though we were doing what, people call non-violent protests. And so these tactics escalated. These tactics by the police escalated when forest defenders, committed acts of civil disobedience by basically making the forest their home to basically stop the tear down of the forest. And in unfortunate news, in January 2023, the city and the state headed by the right-wing Governor Kemp escalated their attacks, creating a police task force made up of the Atlanta Police Department, the DeKalb County Police Department, the GBI, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security. And so the task force began arresting people engaged in civil disobedience, were just camping out in the forest, and charged a bunch of people with domestic terrorism. And January 18th, additional raids took place with more arrests and the killing of forest defender Manuel Tortuguita Terán. And so right now the movement is also planning, more protests. We will not stop. CMB definitely will be, continuing this fight. It is not over. It's really hit a lot of folks hard here in Atlanta with the murder of a protester. With very suspicious, circumstances on like how that happened. But we understand that, Cop City is going to be designed against us. We understand that, they don't want uprisings like 2020 to happen again. We're very well aware of that. Atlanta is one of the most, unequal cities in the country, right? With, rapid gentrification, and, we have this like myth of the Black Mecca, all these wealthy Black folks here, but we also have some of the poorest Black people in the country. The minimum wage in Georgia is like, $7.25. I think legally it's less than that, but the federal minimum is $7.25. So the type of city they're trying to build is one where it's like, I don't even know if I'll be able to afford to live in the next few years. And so all this is connected, all these things is connected. Capitalism needs a force to suppress uprisings, to suppress the very contradictions it creates. And so Cop City is kind of that same thing where, they're putting all this money into building basically a militarized police presence that's, not for solving social issues, but basically for repression. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Comrade Sankara. So the next speaker we have is Fiona Mack from DSA Eco-Socialist Working Group in Connecticut. And I will hand it over to Fiona.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for having me. It's great to meet some other people, listen to where you're all coming from. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I started organizing around the issue of Cop City and what we've done in Connecticut in the last year or so. I don't remember exactly when I first heard about the fight to stop Cop City, but I think it was probably last spring. And at that time, I had just moved back to Connecticut after living out of state for some time. So I was a little bit out of the loop as far as environmental organizing that was happening locally. But I wanted to start organizing as the eco-socialist group for the Connecticut DSA in a smaller state chapter. You know, there's only so many projects people are working on at one time, but I definitely wanted to, my background is definitely involves a lot of environmental organizing and environmental justice. So I wanted to build DSA around that and find other connections in the state. So for me, it was, it seemed like a good issue to do outreach about and reach out to other groups and see who was interested in working on it, because not only was it like very obviously something that environmentalists would be interested in, but also the aspect of just how blatantly overblown policing is becoming and has become, and also to kind of tap into the existing energy around victims of police brutality in Connecticut, which was quite active back in 2020, but you know, is only sporadic at this point. But yeah, for me, it was a way to get involved in a bigger issue and draw a lot of people in and meet a lot of people. And so since then, we started last summer holding solidarity events during one of the week of actions in July. We just set up a table in a park and asked people to make phone calls to different contractors, spread some information, had a little gathering, and that was a very lovely start. We later had just a documentary screening, which had a great turnout, and we had a really good community discussion afterwards. So that was very interesting. And then in January, for the weekend of Solidarity, we held one rally that was put together pretty last minute compared to the other events, but was still quite rewarding, I would say. And then just a few days after that was when Tortuguita was murdered. So we turned around and held a vigil again just the next weekend. And we've gained a lot of momentum since then, with a lot more groups joining a more formal statewide coalition. We've been planning around this week's week of action to target contractors in Connecticut, including what we discovered was the global headquarters of the AXAXL insurance company. So we had a rally there on Monday, and another one at a subcontractor today. So yeah, it's been definitely great to see how many people have been interested in getting involved, even though it's can seem so far removed. There are obviously overlapping issues here in Connecticut, such as all of the police brutality in our various cities and from state troopers as well, and a lot of parallels existing in a fight to preserve some woods in the city of Bridgeport, actually right next to my elementary school, about 400 acres of forest that was previously had a Remington Arms manufacturing plant. So there are a lot of discarded shotgun shells and all sorts of detritus, but it's been abandoned for decades. So the forest has really retaken it at this point. But it's owned by some contractors who want to develop it into an office park. And they've been going through the remediation process to get to that point. But so far, public opposition and the extent of remediation that's necessary has prevented them from developing it. So yeah, good ways to, it's been really great to just make a lot of connections, and hopefully build towards stopping Cop City, since we do have the opportunity to prevent it from occurring. And I think that's really important to steer the fate of the forest in that direction. And because for so many reasons, it's like very exemplary of the value of solidarity that I, want to be upholding at every step of my organizing.
Thank you, Fiona. I was muted. So next we'll have Colo, member of Workers' Voice from the San Francisco Bay Area and public school educator.
All right, thank you, Sean. So I'm going to read some remarks and I'll try to go a little bit slow so that the translation can keep up. So as Sean said, my name is Kolo Wamba, and I'm a rank and file member of Workers' Voice. I'm also an educator. Hello, all my AFT Local 1493 people out there. And I am a concerned parent to 2 teenage African Americans. And I'm very honored to be here to deliver these remarks on behalf of my Revolutionary Socialist Party Workers' Voice. We're now at a critical juncture in the fight against police terror, and how we respond as a class is of paramount significance. We have a real opportunity in the present moment to build mass solidarity and play a major role in shaping this movement. And I'll return to this important point toward the end of my remarks. Before I do that, I will lay out the present crisis of police violence and highlight its connections to environmental destruction, the prison industrial complex, the immigration crisis, the crisis of indigenous rights, and US imperialism, all of which share the common denominator of being direct byproducts of global capitalism. Indeed, the fight against all these things is really one and the same struggle, and that is fundamentally the fight to overthrow global capitalism and replace it with global socialism. So as Sankara said, I'll just repeat some of what Sankara said. Announced in 2021, Atlanta's Cop City is but one of a whole host of similar planned facilities intended to fast track the ongoing state project to fully militarize the police as the violent enforcer of white supremacy and US imperialism. Everything about the Atlanta Cop City project highlights the brazenness with which corrupt corporate and government actors operate. Cop City's main backer is a private nonprofit called the Atlanta Police Foundation, APF, that is funded by corporations such as Delta, Coca-Cola, Home Depot, and Bank of America, to name a few. Over $60 million of the funding for Cop City will be coming directly from APF. Another 30 million will be from taxpayers. So Cop City was approved by the Atlanta City Council amid considerable public protest. Oh dear, okay. I've got to move or the lights turn out. Amid considerable public protest and over the objections of the vast majority of residents in surrounding communities, which are historically Black, although facing some of the most extreme and rapid gentrification in the country. But by having peaceful protesters brutalized and arrested, the Atlanta City Council clearly demonstrated its prioritization of the interests of corporations, wealthy white Atlantans, and the APF over those of its own community, particularly its Black, brown, and indigenous residents. Cop City will occupy a significant swath of the South River Weelaunee Forest, an urban forest that adjoins a working class, poor Black community that stands to bear the brunt of its ill effects. To quote an article by mainline reporter Asia Arnold, this land was originally inhabited by Muskogee Creek Nation tribes before they were forcibly removed by colonial genocide. It was then sold in a land lottery to a plantation owner for chattel slavery. The land eventually became owned by the city of Atlanta and operated as a prison farm until 1985, which was decommissioned in 1995. And the current lease agreement sells the land to APF for $10 a year. Cop City is designed to, that's the end of the quote. Okay, Cop City is designed to train police to engage in urban warfare against civilians. It will include things like a bomb testing facility and a setup for practicing the use of tear gas against the same civilians. Of course, the civilians in question are always going to be predominantly working class, Black and brown, because that is ultimately what this is about. Upholding the supremacy of capital, which in this country automatically means upholding white supremacy. It's important to point out that the construction of Cop City will destroy at least 85 acres of urban forest. This is significant because urban forests are vital to mitigating urban heat islands and improving urban air quality. Moreover, this particular urban forest contains Entrenchment Creek, whose already degraded condition will become even more flood prone by the worsening soil erosion that will come with the removal of so many trees. Of course, all of these effects are amplified by the ongoing crisis of climate change. And then on top of this, there's the additional air, water, soil, and noise pollution that inevitably accompanies the operation of any large-scale firearms and explosive weapons training facility. Not only would Cop City deprive largely Black communities of public green space, it would create a constant warlike atmosphere that is already worsening people's quality of life and threatening local wildlife. Atlanta residents are already seeing tanks driven through their communities and facing increased surveillance by low-flying helicopters in retaliation to their resistance to the training center. Put simply, Cop City would be, and already is, devastating to the mostly Black and brown, mostly Black and working class communities in the area, and is a clear-cut and obvious case of environmental racism, as has already been said. Cop City also has a connection to US imperialism overseas. The Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, GILEE, a joint project of Georgia State University and local, state, federal, and international law enforcement agencies, has for years been an institution that has promoted links between Israeli and US police forces. Police departments from more than 25 states, including the NYPD, participate in GILEE-sponsored programs. The NYPD has a long record of racial and religious profiling and policing Black and brown communities in a way that is comparable to military occupation forces. Cops from states such as Maryland, Florida, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, California, to name just a few, have all traveled to Israel for training. Federal agencies from ICE to the Capitol Police in DC have also been trained by Israel. Additionally, thousands of local and state police have been trained by Israeli officials here in the US. As for the training itself, it always emphasizes the repressive tactics employed by Israeli state forces in their subjugation of Palestinian civilians in their own communities. With Cop City, it would be naive not to expect all of this sort of thing to continue, if not to get much, much worse. In a system in which profits can be realized by violently repressing people and incarcerating them, it goes without saying that the impulses that lead to Cop City are the same that detain countless undocumented immigrants in deplorable conditions and have them working for slave wages, such as is the case at Mesa Verde, an ICE detention center in Southern California, where detained workers have been on strike since last March. We should see Cop City as part of a larger offensive by the US state against our civil liberties. In short, due to the inability of US capitalism to solve any of the problems that it has created, The ruling class is losing its ability to politically maneuver, while the working classes and oppressed peoples have become increasingly desperate, and in some cases combative. This combativity has been especially expressed by Black, Indigenous, and Latino communities in fights around police brutality, extractivism, and the deportation machine. Despite the liberal veneer of the Democratic Party, states and cities dominated by Democrats actually spend the most on law enforcement. And despite the violent tendencies of far-right actors, police are much more likely to confront left-wing protests such as Black Lives Matter. The ruling class's response to the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests in 2020 ended up being legislative restrictions on protests, rather than doing anything real and concrete to address police violence. There have been 236 bills in 45 states, with 36 already enacted and 12 pending. These laws aim to restrict the ability to protest on campuses, around pipelines, and on Capitol grounds. Many states are proposing legislation which redefines a riot so that police can get greater authority to disperse them or arrest protesters. We should make no mistake. All of this legislation regarding protesting is a response to the protests of 2020 and previous movements like Ferguson and Standing Rock, not the attack on the Capitol in January of 2021. In fact, investigations of the January 6th attack have found that many of those involved were actually law enforcement themselves. Of course, law enforcement's infestation by white supremacists is certainly nothing new. It is experienced daily by those who are the most policed. But instead of actually addressing people's demands to abolish or defund the police, what seems to get done is quite the opposite. Police killings of civilians have actually gone up since the 2020 protests, and I will rattle off a few recent instances here. Just a few recent instances here. LA Peace recently killed Anthony Lowe. Lowe, a double amputee, had lost his lower legs as a result of a prior altercation with police in Texas. Donovan Lewis was shot in his bed by police in Columbus, Ohio, who were serving a warrant at 2 a.m. And then Cambridge police fatally shot Saeed Faisal, a student at the University of Massachusetts. And then there's the killing of Tyree Nichols by 5 Memphis police officers, who official accounting of how it went down was quickly shown to be a blatant lie. The officers claimed that Nichols had been the aggressor, while the released video evidence clearly shows otherwise. And then in the case of the fatal shooting of forest protector Manuel Tortuguita Perez Terán by Atlanta police, a matter that I'll come back to in a moment. Despite the police charge that Tort had fired the first shot, there are now indications that the officer who was wounded in the incident may have just been hit by friendly fire. The police receive protection from the state as they protect the state. And rare is the case that an officer is held to account for brutality or murder. Examples like the conviction of Chauvin, the murderer of George Floyd, are the exception, not the rule. In fact, this particular case represents a concession to the anti-police terror movement, similar to the quick firing and arrest of the Memphis police officers responsible for killing Tyree Nichols. It's designed to calm people down and give symbolic credibility to the criminal justice system, which we all know is a sham. We should expect the new anti-protest and anti-civil liberties laws to be used against the left far more readily and vigorously than they ever get deployed against far-right actors of the sort that attacked the US Capitol on January 6th. Let's also not forget that Biden's 2021 national security strategy explicitly identifies climate and anti-capitalist activists as likely targets. Democrat-led Atlanta has been especially vicious in attacking protesters, both physically and legally. Starting in December 2022, anyone arrested at protests in connection with Stop Cop City has been charged with domestic terrorism. Many have been refused bail, while others have seen bail set at hundreds of thousands of dollars. The justification for these quote unquote domestic terrorism charges in court filings are so broad as to include sleeping in a hammock in the woods and being affiliated with the quote unquote organization Defend Atlanta Forest. Note that there is no organization called Defend Atlanta Forest. Rather, this name is just used on social media and websites that compile and share information and action items from the broader movement. So far, over 20 people have been arrested on these charges. And the day before the release of footage of Tyree Nichols' murder, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp declared a state of emergency, giving himself potentially dictatorial powers to suppress and repress protests. Let me now come back to the Atlanta police raid that murdered Manuel Tortuguita. Although police claim that there was no video footage of the raid, body cam footage from officers in the surrounding area offer conflicting evidence to the original cop narrative. This includes the claim that Tortuguita supposedly shot and wounded an officer. In the body cam footage, the first shots that are heard appear to be suppressed gunfire, which almost certainly would be coming from the police. After the barrage of bullets that killed Tort, an Atlanta officer is heard asking, "They shoot their own man?" Tort's family is demanding an independent investigation, and this is an important fight for us to take up and support. Well, I appreciate everyone attending tonight, and I'd like to close my remarks with some lessons and conclusions that have been rattling around in our heads. In the first place, the situation in Atlanta is in no way isolated to a single city. The whole political and economic situation in this country is defined by the decay and decline of US imperialism. Working class and oppressed people are being squeezed in a million different ways in our daily lives, from gentrification to climate catastrophe to chemically charged train derailments. The situation is leading to an explosion of opportunities and examples of combativity. On the other hand, the ruling class, the big bosses, landlords, bankers, have virtually no avenues for concessions. Instead, what they have to offer is an endless stomach for brutality. We need to see the situation in Atlanta as a testing ground. The state and corporations around the country are watching to see if the APF, acting as a vanguard of reaction, can be successful in building Cop City. If the Atlanta, DeKalb County, Georgia State, and federal police are successful in pressing charges of domestic terrorism against and murdering protesters, they're trying to see if they can build cop cities in their own backyards. And they are testing to see how brutal they can be against activists in their own cities and states. This leads to the second point, which flows immediately from these conceptions. The opposition and movement against Cop City and in solidarity with activists being repressed in Atlanta must be a nationwide and international movement. Unfortunately, it took the murder of Tortuguita to really begin putting this conception in motion. That is not to say that people around the country have not been carrying out important solidarity and building work since the beginning of this movement. There have been multiple successful weeks of action, informational sessions in many different places, solidarity events and fundraising, acts of disruption, and civil disobedience. But it is true that the movement is in a new and higher place with much more understanding around the country. What can the character of nationwide and international solidarity be? In the first place, it is necessary for every progressive and democratic-minded person to support the fight to get charges dropped against activists and have an independent investigation into Tort's murder. The labor movement has a long history of building mass civil liberties defense, as do wings of the climate movement, especially those at the intersection of indigenous liberation and the opposition to the ongoing theft of indigenous lands, which is to say the indigenous-led section. Nationwide civil liberties defense means building the broadest possible networks of support. I'm sorry, what was that?
I was just asking if you could please wrap up soon.
Oh, okay, yes. Which is to say the indigenous, Okay, the best type of organizations to anchor this effort would be a labor party based in the unions. Unfortunately, this does not yet exist in the United States. At the same time, the Democratic Party has shown its total servility to the corporations that it represents, the same corporations funding and building cop cities. And every step forward the movement takes against the Democrats is an important lesson in that party's inability to lead struggles. Okay, so I'm just going to skip to the end of my remarks here. Workers' Voice is participating in this movement to the best of our ability. Our intention with this forum is to participate in discussion with activists around the country and world and help share their perspectives broadly. We are excited to deepen these connections and continue to build the struggle. We are pushing for our members, readers, and friends, including everyone watching this forum right now, to participate in local organizing, as well as the upcoming Week of Action in Atlanta, which will be from March 4th to the 11th. We want to highlight the community movement builders and other organizations call for March 9th as a particular day of mobilization led by Black people in opposition to Cop City. Together we are stronger, and together we can win. No cop cities anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade. And we'll have now our last speaker, Wilson, from the PSTU in Brazil.
Can you hear me now? All right, okay. So finally I could show my face here. It was kind of difficult. Living down here, also you have to deal with technology in a weird way. But anyway, so good night, Sean, Sankara, Colo, Fiona, the translator, and most of all, everyone that took the night to hear us. I'm going to try to talk in some general terms. And I will, of course, I would like to start by sending my solidarity to Manuel's family and comrades and friends. He became another victim of violence and everything that has been pointed out by the previous panelists. But I like to emphasize, I have to start by saying that besides being a great pleasure to share this night with you, because it's important to us, like Colo said right now, to have international perspective in relation to this struggle. When I, as a Black gay man here in Brazil who loves jazz, when I heard that I was speaking to Atlanta, I was really moved, because Atlanta is a reference for us as Black people all over the world, because the struggles, the history of the struggles, and also importantly, the history of the racism and violence against people, and with a very important similarity to Brazil. People in Atlanta know the percentage of people, Black people in Atlanta, is very similar to the percentage of Black people in Brazil. Here in the country, we are 56% of the population. So people in Atlanta knows what means to live even in a majority, in a space that has majority of Black people being oppressed by capitalism, being oppressed by the violence, being oppressed by a system that is not a question of justice. That's what I want to point out. It's not just a question of majority against minority. It's a question of class overall. So, and because of that, besides all the Black inheritance and connections I have with Atlanta, I was especially happy by being invited as a member of PSTU. For those who don't know, the PSTU is the Socialist Workers Party United here in Brazil. And we are a sister organization of the Workers' Voice, or La Voice, as members of an international organization called the International Works League, IWL, or LIT in Spanish, Liga Internacional dos Trabalhadores, and I have been involved with this international current, the same one, because we had other names before founding PSTU when we were expelled from PT, from the Workers' Party, from Lula's party. We were expelled in 1992. Before that, you had some other names, and I got in contact, just to know something about me, I got in contact with this international organization in 78. I'm quite old, I was 14, 15 years old when I joined the socialist struggle, the international socialist struggle. And because of this perspective, I'm especially happy to talk with you, because more than ever, internationalism is necessary. And what's going on in Cop City is an example of it. We have we are not going to have the conditions to develop it, I think, and we can have other discussions. Our history is very similar in many ways: the colonization, the invasion of Europeans, the slavery, and so on. But the development of our countries were different. And so, for instance, you have very different problems in relation the way to deal with policy and repression in the capitalist state. At the end of the day, unfortunately, the result is the same. Okay, it goes against the poorest people, the not white people, and so on. And its main task is to defend the private property of capitalism. You cannot never forget that. That when you talk about armed forces, you are talking about one of the main arms of capitalism, that is to have an arm, different kinds of arms, ready to defend their private property. And to do so also with the disposition to repress any struggle that goes, that threatens the private property. So, but even like that, you have differences in our history. But one thing that you can be sure, and that's also different in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere, the police forces work in a different way. But what we have to understand is that the problems that we're suffering are all over the world because one single and unique enemy, a very parasitical and destructive bourgeoisie in a very specific moment of capitalism where even the natural resources, the environment is being totally destroyed. We are seeing all over the world destruction of this caused by taking the natural resources and attacking the environment of so many forms that we can not even name all of them. But we are seeing the result of it in the climate situation. All over the after we give an example during Carnival here, but we are seeing also the effects of this parasitical bourgeoisie in terms of the rise of exploitation of the working class, the rise of inhuman conditions of living, education, health, all over the world, and of course, as part of the history of itself, mainly in the moments where the crises are deepened, the oppression is stronger. It's a law of capitalism because oppressing because of race, ethnicity, gender identity, sex orientation, origin, region, and so on, immigrant, and so on, is very lucrative to bourgeoisie in many ways. Lucrative in the sense of over-exploiting a huge sector of the working class, keeping an arm of unemployed people or sub-employed people that can be used to lower the salaries of everyone in the society. And at the same time, the increase of oppression and ideologies and even governments. We had Bolsonaro here. We just got out of Bolsonaro, one of the most terrible periods of our history. I am 59 years old now. And 50, I'm sorry. I mean, raise my age. I'm 55 now. But so I was a kid under dictatorship here. So I can talk about the dictatorship. I became a militant because I was living under dictatorship. And but Bolsonaro's government was one of the worst of our history. But Bolsonaro is not isolated. My cat, Edith Piaf. Bolsonaro was not an isolated phenomenon in the world. You had Trump there, you have Orban in Hungary, you have Italy, you have Poland, you have Putin in Russia. All over the world, you have governments that are using more and more oppression and repression to impose their economical plans. And when I received the invitation, of course, the first thing that came to my mind, just to quote, then you can discuss further, was the Yanomami situation here in Brazil. All of you must be following the situation of the indigenous people in a huge area of Amazon. And remember, the need of internalize our discussions is Amazon is an example. Amazon is not Brazilian. Amazon is part of South America. It takes part of different countries, and unfortunately for the indigenous people, the capitalist frontiers don't exist. So you cannot even talk about saving Amazon if you don't have international perspective over it. But anyway, the Yanomami people, of course, under Bolsonaro's government, the situation went to levels that are unbearable. Just to give a number, between 2019 and 2022, more than 570 Yanomami children died of things that could be prevented by health or many by health. During the discredited and chronic children that we are seeing the news are the result of malnutrition for years and years. Malnutrition that was provoked by the companies that the logging companies, the mines and the agribusiness companies, most of them transnational companies that are using the area to mine or to produce a soybean that is used to feed cattle and not people. And this situation is devastating the area, but you have to see that if Bolsonaro was bad, unfortunately, PT, the Workers' Party, Lula's government cannot say that it was not very different, but they cannot they cannot say for sure that they stopped or they avoided the killing of Yanomami people and even the dying by hunger. There was a research made here in Brazil and published by BBC News last year in 2014 that showed that between 2008 and 2014, that means between Lula's government and Dilma Rousseff government, the president from PT that took over after Lula, between 2008 and 2014, 419 Yanomami children died of hunger, of malnutrition in the Yanomami area. So we are talking about more people dying under Bolsonaro, but we're not talking about people not dying under PT's government. And I'm saying that because this combination of race, ethnicity, class, oppression, violence is that what guarantees the interest of just a few people. And when you talk about the combination of ethnicity, local of living, and the environment, we have to remember that, for instance, also in relation to, just to give an example, just last year, under Bolsonaro's government, 11,000 square kilometers. I know you work with miles, but it's the size, two times the size of Trinidad Tobago. Just last year, 2 Trinidad Tobagos of the forest were taken out of the existence. Okay, that's a huge area, enormous area, and then we can not explain, and that's the other thing that I was giving about this relationship between environment and race. You know that you were last week, we are still actually under Carnival spell. You know, Carnival is the biggest festivity in Brazil. But this year, Carnival was very weird because it was the first one after pandemic. But at the same time, in the middle of Carnival, there was a tragedy that killed so far 60 people, and more than 50 are still missing in an area here in the north shore of São Paulo because the rain, a very strong rain, totally out. Is our rain season, but it was totally out of control, something that you have never seen that area. And of course, now the governments are saying that it is the fault of the people who are living in very risky areas. But that is a bad joke, because people are living in that risky areas because they don't have housing, they don't have conditions to live or to pay rent or to buy houses anywhere else. And these situations are just examples of how the things are related. But you have to remember that also that these problems are not problems that are related only to specific governments or more or less democratic bourgeoisie. We are talking about, of course, having more or less democratic bourgeoisie makes a difference. You know about that. And here, because here in Brazil, one of our main demands in PSTU since the beginning of Bolsonaro's government, but mainly during the electoral process last year. And you surely know that they tried a Capitolio way out here, a la Trump. On the 8th of January, they invaded, the extreme right invaded our Congress, the Supreme Court, and another building in the main area of the center of the power, our DC here in Brazil, Brasilia, and they invaded and destroyed the building and so on. Of course, we cannot, in face of all that, we in PSTU are very strong in defending the need of self-defense. Here it's a reality, and it has to do with the Cop City situation, because in the process, we think that in the process of denouncing the use of the state repression to repress the movement, to attack our comrades, to kill our people, and to do all of that combining racial oppression and capitalist exploitation, we also have to defend ourselves. And how do you do that here in Brazil? For instance, just to give an example, we have here in Brazil, it's very common, more common in the 80s than in the United States, but you have a lot of occupations, housing occupations. People who occupy areas that are private areas, state areas that are not being used and so on, when they raise their houses there with wood material or scratch and so on. And some years ago, when they tried to, unfortunately, they did demolish a whole neighborhood that had more than 8,000 people already. We resisted by organizing the labor unions, the social movements, and we build ourselves like protections with shields and weapons with wood, and used helmets, and you made an army that actually was organized by a woman from the occupation itself, who was the lead of the security that we always also have in this kind of thing. So we are saying that because many to face extreme right, we don't have to be ingenious and think that they are not going to attack us as they are attacking us for a long time. But even having these actions that are necessary, you have to have policies toward the system as a whole. What I said in the beginning, and I would like to emphasize, is that when you talk about this kind of situation, you have to understand that it's part of the system itself. For instance, just to give you another example, Here in Brazil, we talk a lot about the genocide of the Black youth. So to just give you a number, on the last violence report that is published here in Brazil, they said that 71% for every 100 people killed in Brazil, 71 are Black. I don't know if you understand the number. That's huge. So any kind of homicide, like a fire gun, knives, and so on, for every 100 people, 71 are Black. Killed by the police, for every 100, for each people, 77 are killed by the police. We are 56% of population. We are the majority of unemployed. We are the majority of the ones without housing. We are the majority out of school and out of university. But overall, we are the majority of people being killed by the police. A police that in Brazil has a specificity that's very important to understand our program and our policies towards it. Our police was created. We have different policies in the city and in the states, but the main force is called the military police. Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, so the military police is a heritage of the dictatorship, the times of dictatorship, and it works as a military police. Very racist, very repressive. Linked with the organized crime or the militias that we call here, the so-called militias that you have a lot of them, like the ones who killed Marielle Franco some years ago. And all these people, besides, and this police is controlled by the state. Why I'm quoting this example? Because even the police that's controlled by the state, even when the Workers' Party was governor, PT governor Bahia, which is the biggest, the blackest state in the country, and there, the number of Black people increased under this government, and under federal government was the same. So to close it, so you can talk a little bit about all of this. First of all, I'd like to extend. You can discuss here in Brazil how to have a concrete action in relation to support the struggle Stop Cop City through divulgating it, write an article. I can interview somebody for our national newspaper and part of the team, or for our site. We can arrange that afterwards. And overall, I think that you have to create connections through our entities, like the labor unions, the social communities, the social organizations, from the movement. Because if you don't have a class perspective to solve this problem, and even to solve the security, we think that the police should be controlled by a class council, not a community council, but a council that's formed by the organizations of the working class, the social movements, the Black organizations, the women organizations, LGBTQ organizations, so on, but in a class perspective. If you, more than never, a class perspective and internationalist perspective is the only way out for the majority of the world. When Lenin said that we're living through socialism or barbarism, we are seeing that in some parts of the world, the barbarism is already free, happening. So more than ever, we need a socialist perspective and a way out for the crisis that affects more than anybody else, the oppressed and the historical marginalized sectors. Sorry about the time.
Thank you, Comrade. And thanks to all of our panelists and speakers. I want to open the floor now for comrades who are attending the meeting to raise any questions or comments. If you want to just ask a question for like Q&A or something like that, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Type your question in there and we can see it and have the panelists respond or read it more generally. But also, if you want to make a comment, feel more than free to raise your hand or write in the chat that you want to get on Stack, and we can go ahead and press to let you speak to us. Okay, here's a good start. I think this one's for you, Fiona. An attendee asks, what's next in Connecticut to help with the campaign to stop Cop City?
Excellent question. So on Wednesday, March 1st, so next week, we're going to have a fundraising event. It's going to be in New Haven at the Bradley Street Bike Co-op from 7 to 9, and we're going to be just doing some different activities and fundraising for the Atlanta Solidarity Fund. And then the week after that, we have tentative plans to have an action possibly on the UConn Stores campus. So stay tuned for more details there, but it would also be it'd be great to see you at the fundraiser on Wednesday.
All right, thanks a lot, Fiona. This is a good one more generally. Sorry. Tani asks, I'm working on organizing a couple awareness raising and solidarity building events just outside of Seattle, but are there any other actions that I can take in my hometown to amplify the cause and increase our impact from afar? I don't know if you have anything specific, Sankara, that the movement in Atlanta has been asking in solidarity from folks from above.
So can you repeat the question? Was it people that are outside of the country?
Or outside of Atlanta, outside of Georgia.
Okay, okay, outside of the Georgia.
As a counselor as well, I would like to ask you that. So if you can answer all together, how you can help from here from Brazil.
Yeah, I would say for outside of the state of Georgia, I know, definitely fundraisers and like solidarity things. So like, there's a week of solidarity from the 19th to 26th. People have, held fundraiser for the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, which is basically kind of like, they help out with, against anti-police repression. They help bail people out. They help, make sure people who are facing police violence from the movements are like well taken care of. So like, that's something that, people can do. And also March 4th through the 11th, there's a week of action. And so people are asking for folks, if they can, to come down to Atlanta and help, with the movement. If you want to, the DTF says if you want to bring a tent and stay a while, you can. So those are just a few things that people can basically do. Also, if people could go to Stop Reeves Young, which is STOPREEVESYOUNG.com. And so, there's a campaign about the people basically, the APF can't destroy the forest and build Cop City on their own. So they need contractors and they need firms. And so StopReevesYoung.com has information on different firms and contractors. And, people are asked to do protests in their locale. If some of these firms have, offices or people in these locales to basically stand in solidarity with us. As far as like out of the country, I'm actually not sure exactly. Outside of maybe donating to Atlanta Solidarity Fund. I know I've mostly talked to people domestically, but I haven't really had too many international contacts. So that's an open question.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. And there's also the website stopcopcitysolidarity.org, which also has some resources for people interested in doing solidarity actions or checking to see if there are any subcontractors and things like that in your area which you can, take action against. I know when I showed it to a comrade, they were like, "Oh shit, one of these contractors is like across the street from where I live," and you just don't even know it, that it's there. And I think, internationally too, one of the big things that can help, is what Wilson mentioned, right? Having international organizations, write up stories about what's going on, spreading information, just getting these links out into people's hands. But also, I think something really important for us to do internationally is to get international organizations and some countries where labor and social movement organizations are a little more eager to get into condemning the state than they are here in the United States. It can be kind of hard to get the AFL-CIO to do anything, to issue statements and things like that, and send those as well. That can be really helpful. We have a question. How many people in the community around the Cop City know that a national movement is developing? And I think this can kind of be combined with, the question of like, what kind of work is being done to make sure that this movement is, implanted in and part of the community.
So I could speak a little bit to that. There has been, some canvassing efforts and some outreach efforts in kind of that area. So, South DeKalb, which is kind of like mostly, a lot of it's like unincorporated Atlanta. It is majority Black. The further north you go, it becomes more mixed and then more white. But I think that's been kind of like sporadic. As far as like it's been on and off. Different people have done like different events in the area. There was an event just a few weeks ago hosted by I think some indigenous communities on like the DeKalb County side of Metro Atlanta, kind of informing people about what's happening. And so, but then there's also, there's been counter narratives also on the news because, a lot of people are tuned into like local news. And so local news has been very antagonistic against the movement. And so if you're not connected with someone close to it, you'll have like a different narrative. So I think that's one thing folks are still working on is making sure people, Black folks in Atlanta in general, and people in Atlanta in general, and people specifically in South DeKalb, have like another side, and folks are steady trying to continually make contact with people who live in that general area, because there has been, a campaign to defame the movement and put bad press out there. And so we want to alter those perceptions, and having like weeks of actions and things, public events like that is a way to get people out and to also introduce the movement to new folks.
Yeah, and just to add, one other thing to keep in mind too is that this is a process that's been going on for almost 3 years now, and in struggles that stretch out that long, people come in and people fall out, right? And things happen in people's lives, and someone could easily have had, could have been super involved in the beginning of the Stop Cop City campaign, and now they have a 2-year-old, and life comes at you, right? A lot of things have been done. Early on, I remember there were community barbecues and things like that to build outreach, especially during the campaign, to get people to come out and speak at the few, public meetings that were held before the lease was approved and things like that. And there's also, like Sankara was talking about, the press is against it, right? Or is against the movement, right? And part of the reason is because Cox Media Group, the company that owns the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the city's major newspaper, as well as WSB Radio, the city's largest radio station, and WSB-TV, one of the major, basic cable news stations, is owned by them. And Cox Media Group funds APF. So people involved in the movement have set up, a counter website, the Atlanta Community Press Collective, which publishes articles related to the movement and things like that as well. So yeah, I'm gonna jump to a comrade who has something to say real quick. Evan, go ahead.
Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for these great presentations, everybody. I really appreciate the time that y'all are taking on Friday evening, and everybody in the audience. I'm Evan. I've been working with Fiona. I'm a member of Workers' Voice here in Connecticut, and I want to talk about a couple of things and perhaps ask a question. The things I want to talk about are like, one, I think something that Sean said about the international support kind of resonated with me in the United States, which is that a lot of organizations that we would perhaps not expect to be involved with this movement and I'm sorry for translators if I'm speaking too fast, but a lot of organizations that we would not expect to get involved with struggles that are so explicitly anti-police have been entering into this movement. And I think this is really significant, not just in the immediate sense that it's important for a lot of groups and organizations to be fighting against Cop City, which it is certainly important, but in the kind of broader sense of what this means for the period that we're entering into which is that the crises of capitalism that Colo and Wilson especially have been speaking to on an international basis are so extreme that like it's becoming more and more a question of which side are you on. And part of what makes Stop Cop City such like an important struggle and such a kind of dividing line is because you are either for or you are against the construction of Cop City. There's no middle ground, and this is really kind of shaking things up in a lot of important ways. So I wanted to mention that because it was something that I was thinking about and that I thought could be highlighted. The other thing I wanted to bring up is kind of what Colo was starting to talk about, but I think he got cut off a little bit in his speech about the civil liberties aspect of the struggle, because I think that's really essential. And I'll stop after one more minute, Sean, don't worry. Because when we look back at the last 10 years of social movements, especially the Black movement, indigenous movements, there's been really extreme police repression and increasing police repression. I was lucky enough to spend time recently with Crystal Tubles currently of Honor of the Earth, who is a leader at Standing Rock and who was charged with a RICO case on behalf of the Energy Transfer Partners as a federal indictment, which is a really extreme charge. It was ultimately dropped with prejudice, as they say. But these are the sorts of things that are becoming more common against activists, and especially activists in Black and other oppressed movements. So I think it's really essential that we take on explicitly the civil liberties defense, like Colo was talking about. And I was wondering if Wilson had any thoughts about that in a Brazilian context, and if Colo had more thoughts perhaps that he hasn't been able to speak on, and Fiona and Sankara as well, if y'all have been thinking about this aspect, because I think it's really essential and it's a big part of this movement now that people have been charged with domestic terrorism and Tortuguito was murdered. Thanks.
Thanks, Conrad. So yeah, to the panelists, whoever wants to go ahead and start. The question of the civil liberties aspect of the fact that over 20 people have been charged with domestic terrorism in this movement. Sankara, I see you unmuted yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's a very important part, right? Just because when we think about like, speech and like, or even like, you know, resistance, nonviolent resistance. I mean, even the idea, I mean, if you look at like, the the FBI, how they talk about, right, environmental terrorism, right? That's a thing, right? And this whole war on terror thing, started with, of course, like, with the 9/11 attacks. But when they're talking about environmental terror, they're talking about people sitting in trees. They're talking about maybe even property destruction, right? Which, any other regular person who was, I don't know, disregarding private property rights, you're not going to be charged with terrorism. That's a completely absurd thing. So that's definitely put in place to repress movements. It's like totally illegitimate. And so like that's definitely something that we also have to like push to basically say like, hey, the state is repressing people's liberties and speech, freedom of speech. There was a protest, not, around last year that was pretty much, like a family, family friendly protests. No one was breaking any laws. And the police just like attacked it like viciously and like arrested folks and like, even arrested one of the cop watch people. They were just grabbing people that some people, weren't even part of the protest. And so the civil liberties aspects is definitely something that, any movement when it comes to state repression has to deal with, right? Because cops don't have to follow the law. A lot of time they arrest you and ask questions later. And so, yeah, that's what I have to say.
Yeah, could I add a couple things? Yeah, just jump in here. So yeah, actually, thank you for those comments, Sankara, and also Evan. I think one thing that hasn't been said yet, that is also very relevant, is that when we talk about bringing this struggle into the trade unions and taking the trade unions to more of a sense of a class consciousness, right? One thing that's very important that we need to consider is that at least in this country, the police are also considered workers, and they have a union, right? There's a police trade union, right? And so we need to end that, right? We need to do what we can to kick the police out of the trade union movement, right? They're not workers, and they don't have our class interests, right, at heart, right? They're serving the interests of the bourgeoisie. So yeah, I think that's a very important struggle that we need to advance, is to break away from having the police be considered workers that are part of the labor movement.
Wilson, go ahead. You're muted, comrade.
All right.
There we go.
Okay. Now, just to make some remarks about what was said, and also linking with some questions that I saw here in the panel and already, I think that we are in a world that, for instance, the postmodern people and reformists, they think that talking about intersectionality is something new among us ourselves. But I think the Marxists ever, all the time, since the beginning, said that the connections of things inside of capitalism have to, they are all connected in some ways. And but the connection, what links them, and what we have to understand is the character of class of the society. Because why I'm saying that? Because as I said before, I tried to say before, we are facing a situation in the world where the building, for instance, the end of a forest to build a cop city has to do with a moment of the capitalism that we are in a crossroad. The system is in a crossroad in so many ways, environmental ways, in economical ways, in political ways, in so many ways. We are facing a very specific period of the history, and you have to have knowledge to acknowledge that to see how necessary our struggle is right now. And because of this, because the whole situation of crisis, having an apparatus of repression is important to repress all the movements, all the movements. Of course, by the history of bourgeoisie itself, it starts always by the historical marginalized people. We Black people, we LGBT people, we women, we indigenous people, we who are the easiest targets. Okay, but what the person that you have to discuss with the working class as a whole, in the labor unions, in the social movements, is that what affects, like Marx said, wrote many time ago, much time ago, that said the white word, using his word, the worker with light skin will not be emancipated, while the worker with black skin is not in freedom. And you have to discuss all the time. It's the same thing about heterosexual people, LGBT people, men and women, and so on, indigenous people and people from other origins. And knowing that is important, because what's going on here in Brazil and here all over the world is that in face of the crisis, the ways out, the proposals of the right wing are being spread all over, all over. Our extreme right wing that tried to take over the capital on January has connections with Trumpists, has connections with European people, has connections with neo-Nazi people, and so on. And I'm not saying that our main problem now is to face a fascist wave in the world. I'm saying that it's part of we have to consider nowadays as part of the bourgeois democracy, more repression. Is a need of the ruling class, and because of that, you have to know how to raise against them, because to defend. Just to give you an example to finish it, that has something to do with I said before. For instance, here in Brazil, one of the examples are different, but you have to know that they destroyed a whole area, a huge area. I'm talking about 100 bigger than the devastation of Amazon last year. Area called Belo Monte to build a hydroelectric power plant in the north of Brazil. Only to build this hydroelectric power plant, they delocated 50,000 people, 50,000 indigenous people, Black people, people who are what we call forest people, people who live in some kind of balance with the forest and take their survival from there. I'm talking about 50,000 people that were relocated to build this hydroelectric, that just to support the local bourgeoisie and the international companies that you establish, the mining companies that are now destroying Amazon. So there's a link. And by that time, even going against the speech of progress and civilization that would bring jobs and bring opportunities to everybody, Black people from the traditional communities, indigenous people, the labor unions, they got together and they fought a lot. But what was the problem? They did not win the fight because this project that was drawn under dictatorship in the 70s was being made by the British government. I'd like to end with that, because what's the problem? You have, when you talk about struggling, fighting against the destruction that is produced by the bourgeoisie, we have to face also that in the middle of the way, there is a whole discussion about saving the democracy through the conciliation of classes, like the Workers' Party did here, and at the end of the day, the destruction is made. So we have to find solutions among ourselves. And because of that, putting the discussions together, environmental discussion, race discussion, gender discussion, sexual orientation discussion, and class discussion is fundamental to find a way to reunite what the bourgeoisie divided through ideologies. Marx always said that the main proposal of oppression any time in the history is to overexploit a sector of the society at the same time that divide us to make to damage our struggle. So you have to, as part of the struggle, have to reunite it. And just to say, I think that we can set afterwards with Sankara, or I talked to the comrades from the Workers' Voice, an interview to be published on our site. And I think to break a little bit the blockade of media and to get some support from the labor unions and organizations who we work with here in Brazil.
Fiona?
Yeah, I was going to answer the question in the chat about the intersection between environmentalism and police brutality. I do think that Cop City is a pretty emblematic example of that intersection. And as Evan said earlier, which was a great point, is that I think it, or at least I hope that it is causing some environmentalists to realize that they have to pick a side on this issue. I think that not only does it show us that police are accelerating climate change by causing deforestation and polluting with tear gas and chemical weapons and shooting ranges and idling SUVs at all hours of every day, but it also kind of reveals that the capitalist plan to address climate change is essentially to let consumption continue unchecked and allow the crisis to accelerate. And as resources grow more scarce, they intend to use police to violently enforce who is and isn't able to access those dwindling resources. So that's about the crux of the intersection as I see it.
Could I add something to that? Yeah, Fiona, that was really great. I would just add one small thing. And that is that, you know, we also need to realize that there's an intimate connection between the police and the U.S. military, right? The police are, you know, they get all this surplus military equipment, you know, that they use, you know, against civilians, right? And the U.S. military is, I think, if I remember correctly, that's the organization with the biggest carbon footprint, you know, by far out of any in the world, right? And so if this country is going to be serious about really addressing climate change, right, it has to do something about its gigantic military, right? I mean, this military budget only seems to go up. No matter what happens, it only goes up. It only gets bigger and more, you know, impressive, and you know, gets, you know, and its emissions, you know, just go up and up and up and up. So yeah, so I'd say right there, that's a very stark illustration of the connection between climate and police.
Yeah, I wanted to also answer a question in the chat about, so someone says, I don't want to rely on politicians to solve anything, obviously, but is there any precedent for out-of-state folk to pressure their representatives to take a stance on Cop City by pressing talking points on national implications of the project? Or is it best to keep things on a more grassroots level to create that pressure? And I think the emphasis has definitely been on like the grassroots pressure. So particularly around like if you go to Stop Reeves Young, and kind of like basically trying to like, you know, cut the legs off the contractors, just so like they aren't able to, you know, complete their project. And also community movement builders has been like involved in like divestment campaigns. So trying to get corporations to divest from the Atlanta Police Foundation, which I'll reiterate, is a private entity that is, you know, funding the police, right? Public-private partnerships, that's the thing now. And so, yeah, we want to emphasize, you know, basically the agency of like folks who are in solidarity of the movement and kind of like using that to stop Cop City. People have already tried, you know, calling Atlanta City Council, and people did, you know, they did those types of things, and you know, the project was already slated to start. So it's like, you know, now the emphasis is more on the direct action, the protests, and the divestment.
Thanks, Harmon. Yeah, I think that kind of leads into one that I think I can answer pretty quickly, which is just have nationally known progressive politicians like Stacey Abrams made a statement on it. I don't think Stacey Abrams has said anything, and I doubt she will. Stacey Abrams probably won't touch this with a 10-foot pole, partly because she's just like every other politician, and she's a self-serving, careerist who's interested not in defending any actual political principle, but only in maintaining their seat in power and access to power. That being said, there are two and only two nationally known progressive individuals that I have heard of who have made any statements regarding Cop City whatsoever. Those are Rashida Tlaib and Cori Bush, neither of which have said stop Cop City. All they have said is that they support an independent investigation into the shooting of Tortuguita, which is like, I guess, bare minimum, congrats on leaping the lowest hurdle. But yeah, we can put no, I don't think there's any hope to be placed in elected politicians doing anything except out of fear for their job around this. Let's see, a couple of questions about the intersection between environmental justice and labor struggles. One more generally, and then if anyone wants to comment more specifically on the relationship perhaps between, or any relationship that might be drawn perhaps between the struggle to stop Cop City and the environmental disaster in East Palestine, Ohio, and the struggle of the railroad workers. Any comments from the panel on that?
No,
Wilson, go ahead.
it's not exactly about that, but it has to do with my perspective from outside. Somebody already said that something that's important to there about the role that these kind of cop cities have in the world. We have a situation in Brazil that we know that most of our military elite is formed by the United States armed forces or police forces and so on. And unfortunately, that is a tradition as very bad, and it has very bloody marks in our history. It was we have now proofs of that. It was the North American, the United States police that came to Brazil to teach our military people to torture under dictatorship. You have a lot of documents on that. Using CIA and FBI and so on. And now it continues to happen. And there's a connection with the question that was made that caught my attention, because also many of our police forces are used or formed or trained in very big international situations. Like Israel is a focus of training of our police forces with the same apartheid perspective that's used there in relation to Palestine, and they came to Brazil like that. Most of our armed forces, actually none of our armed forces were, even the police were judged by the dictatorship participation. Bolsonaro was an example of that. But anyway, at the same time, for instance, Lula's government sent people to Haiti, and these people who were sent to Haiti in the occupation of Haiti now are used to patrol the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, most of them. So this connection, this relationship between all the struggles And this international connection of the repression cannot be minimized in any way. You have to understand it and have to understand how to fight it. You have to also adopt in some way, in somehow, an international perspective. Even people there should know that. So you can also make it, give more sense to their struggle. I think that what done.
Thank you, Carmen. So yeah, just to reiterate, if anyone has anything on the subject of the intersection of labor unions and environmental justice, or ways in which this struggle relates to the railroad workers' struggle, more specifically in the disaster in East Palestine.
Okay, so I'd like to say a few things about that. Now, I'm not all that familiar with the East Palestine thing, but at least from where I sit and I look at that, I mean, of course, it's tragic and it's terrible, but I think that it can be seen as an opportunity for workers around that that industry to begin to now develop class consciousness, right? And when that happens, then they sort of move beyond just worrying about what their contract is and what their working conditions are and how much money they're getting. Then they begin to see the connections between themselves and between other workers across other industries even, and importantly they see their position in the class struggle, right? And I think stuff like that sort of lays bare the position that workers find themselves in, and hopefully that can help them develop more of a class consciousness.
Thanks, Carmen. I just wanted to jump in on a question that Comrade Michael had about the involvement of students in this movement. And you mentioned high school students in particular. I don't know of high school student involvement. Recently, what has happened is that students at the AUC organized some, I think, protests. Maybe they wrote a letter or something first, but they did something publicly that caught the attention of the news, and the mayor of Atlanta, wanting to boost his bona fides with the Black community, with the AUC being like, it's the Atlanta University Center, which is home to 3 extremely prestigious, historically Black colleges and universities in the city. And he went and hosted like a closed town hall, and the students just like tore him apart. There were reports that he was crying afterwards. He fell asleep during part of it. He publicly announced that he's not a sellout. All kinds of very hilarious stuff happened. Following on that, professors from Morehouse wrote a letter opposing Stop Cop City. Recently, a letter from professors at Spelman College, which is the all-women's counterpart to Morehouse. I believe 66 professors, last I saw, had signed an open letter in opposition. Several hundred healthcare providers and faculty associated with Emory University have signed some open letters, and students have been organizing on those campuses as well. So primarily in the university. The other major educational institutions that have taken a major part in the Stop Cop City campaign have actually been preschools. And it's been one of the pleasures of my organizing life to go to a couple of these preschooler-led protests where they like have these adorable little signs that say things like "Don't hurt the trees" and things like that. And there's a great coalition of the parents and the teachers at those preschools, and it's been really great. In K-12 public education, there is a small group of activists who are trying to develop something there, but it is hard going. So yeah, that's kind of where things are at right now as far as education goes. Okay, I wanted to call on Coco, who asked to be called on for stack.
Hey, can you hear me?
We can hear you, comrade.
Okay, so I'm Coco. I'm a member of Central Ohio Revolutionary Socialist, and you know, I heard East Palestine mentioned in relation to this, so I thought I might as well talk about it. I'm in Ohio, and you know, I think one little tidbit that's not particularly relevant is the residents call it East Palestine, but I'm not willing to respect that, so I call it East Palestine. But you know, I think on the ground level here, you know, the government, you know, state government, national government, I think is really downplaying the seriousness of this issue and the contamination that's happened. And I mean, the good thing is, it doesn't seem locals of East Palestine or Ohio generally are believing it. So I think there's a lot of potential to, you know, fight on this. I mean, there are even a lot of scientists who have tried to go out there and independently assess the levels of contamination, but the you know, the police and you know, other security has been attempting to curtail that type of activity or surveilling people, you know, low-key intimidating them. So, you know, all that's to say, I think this relates to Cop City, and that it's another example of how the ruling class continues to militarize the police in order to keep the working class accepting their lot in life. You know, whether that's you know, basically waving the threat of violence in front of the rail workers so they wouldn't go on strike, or, you know, putting up a training station where they'll train the cops to brutalize people across the country in Atlanta, or, you know, intimidating residents of a city whose water is highly likely to be significantly contaminated. You know, these are all ways in which the police once again demonstrate themselves to be an instrument of the ruling class against the working class. But yeah, that's all I had to say. I want to thank all the panelists. This has been really great to hear all your perspectives on this fight, and I hope that we're gonna continue to fight together to stop Cop City. Thanks.
Thanks, comrade. So if anyone has any other, oh, I see a hand now. John, yes, go ahead.
I'm not going to turn my camera on. I just wanted to follow up on what Coco was saying about Norfolk Southern. You know, they're a contributor to Cop City through the Atlanta Police Foundation. And I think a perfect target for our movement in general, for their role in this disaster in Ohio. And we see the connections between, you know, police, unions, environment, and corporate power is all there. And the fact is, too, that, you know, in the climate movement, we've been talking about the idea of the, you know, nationalizing the energy sector under workers' control. And given the Democrats' default and just outright betrayal of the unions in their passing this law to break their potential strike, you know, we need to, you know, really highlight the fact that this wasn't just about wages, but it was about safety, right? And that, you know, the rail unions were fighting for safety, and we see the fruit of that in the neglect by both capitalist parties in East Palestine, Ohio, where this massive disaster happen, and I have friends in Pittsburgh that's, you know, miles and miles away who can smell the chemicals when the wind is right. So, you know, we have an obligation as a union movement to make these connections, right? And to, you know, make these connections in our unions and in the climate movement of how, you know, how do we fight back against this just blatant naked, you know, power grab by these giant corporations and their use of these repressive forces against working class people. Well, anyway, I'll stop.
Thanks, Comrade. Gonna call on Steve Lee real quick. Let me find you and give you permissions. There you go.
Hi, so can you hear me okay?
We can hear you, Comrade.
Hey, nice to see everybody. Really good presentations and excellent discussion. Yeah, just a little more on the East Palestine thing. It seems to me that there's also a real direct connection to the need for rank and file organization within the unions. So for many years, we've had the Railway Workers United that have been trying to win sick leave and better working conditions, and as well as health and safety. And if they had been successful in organizing a campaign that could have turned their unions to actually going on strike or forcing more concessions from the companies, this disaster might have been prevented or mitigated at least. I mean, the whole drive of the railroad industry, which has made big profits recently, has been to extend the length of the trains and to make things much more toxic and so forth. And also the politicians haven't handled it. So we had Obama put forward some safety regulations, which were lobbied against and backed off when he was in power. And then of course, Trump did it one better by removing the small safety regulations that Obama had put in place. And now we have Trump going to the site of the disaster to pass out Trump hats, apparently, MAGA hats, as his solution to the problem when he was he was obviously part of the problem by removing the regulations. So as people have said, both parties committed to capital, committed to maintaining that money flowing into the top instead of ordinary people. So the connections are very strongly there. And hopefully we can get unions to therefore get involved in these kind of environmental campaigns and build rank and file organization that can push the unions in that direction. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Comrade. All right, so I want to ask our panelists if they have any final closing remarks that they want to make, and then I think we will be done.
Yeah. So basically thank all of y'all for like coming to this. We definitely need us in Atlanta, we definitely need support and solidarity. So definitely donate to the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, because without that, we would not be able to help people who are in jail right now, or people who may be arrested in the future. And so definitely go to Stop Reeves Young and see if there's anything you can do locally. Visit communitymovementbuilders.org and support our work. We also do anti-gentrification work on the south side of Atlanta. We also, have a grocery program, all of that. And so, yeah, tweet, post on Instagram, get the message out to as many people as possible. Also spread the Comedy Central video on Stop Cop City around to people. It's one of the few positive news coverage of Stop Cop City movement. So yeah.
Thanks, Carmine. Do any of our other panelists have any closing remarks? Wilson, go ahead.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
No, go talk first. You can talk.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'll go next. So, yeah, I just want to say a couple things. Thing number one is that, thanks to all the panelists, and thanks to everybody who put this together. This is really great. I think we should we have a good reason to feel optimistic, I think, in the present moment. And that is because I think what I see happening is that, and not just me, I think, many of us, within Workers' Voice, even, within my workplace, family, friends, we're seeing that, even as, for instance, folks like Rashida Tlaib and Cori Bush, make these, rather mealy-mouthed, low-key statements, right? Or they're entirely silent on stuff like Cop City. We find that, it's the leaders who are, being this way about Cop City. But if you go within the rank and files of a lot of these organizations, you find that there's growing dissatisfaction with their leadership, and growing, militancy, about this issue. And so I think we can sort of, we're in a position to capitalize on that and, sort of turn this into, something significant. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Herman.
Can I speak?
Yes, go ahead.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I hope that I could help in some perspective. In concrete terms, what I want to talk to you afterwards, so I can talk to Sean or even that contacted me, and Fiona and everyone there, to see if you set a kind of interview to explain to people here in Brazil what's going on and so on. You can publish. I am in the communication team of, besides the gay and the black caucus, I'm in the communication team of PSTU, so I can sit myself to publish here an article explaining to Brazilian people what's going on. Also, we are part of something called CSP Conlutas. CSP Conlutas is a kind of central union that's totally different from most of our in the world, because it's a labor and popular central union that congregates labor unions, popular movements, women movement, black movement, LGBT movement, and so on. We are going to have a national coordination of these CSP Conlutas shortly, and I can write with you a motion that can be voted here by all the labor unions that are part of it, so you can send to us. I cannot assure you about financial help, Sankara, to be very clear, because we are in a third world country, but also right now we are doing donations and campaigning around the Yanomami people. So most of our entities are towards there. We started one of the main unions that we organize is the Metal Workers Union here in the countryside of São Paulo, are responsible in national scale to get money and food for people who are with housing in these floods that I commented about the North Shore. And also you have, we organize a third convoy to Ukraine. You know that Brazil has a whole speech about not taking part in the war. We have taken part, and you have sent already 2 convoys to Ukraine, and you are collecting money and goods for that. But anyway, any political support you can give, you can give. Just to finish something that understood that you are talking about your Palestine there, but the problem, talk about the word Palestine, but the problem that you talked about has to do also the Yanomami situation. Many of the people dying or very sick in Amazon area are dying because the intoxication of products that are used by the factories, the mining companies, the factoring, and all this process with mercury and so on. So this destruction, when I said in the beginning that our bourgeoisie has a parasitical and more and more destructive perspective, we have to think that not only to save the humanity, and I'm sure that task is in front of us, but also to understand that they are not going to stop. That's not in their DNA, it's not in their history, it's not in their perspective. We are living in a situation that even under the pandemic that killed millions of people, the bourgeoisie all over the world got richer and richer. The number of super riches improved all over the world. And so you see by the characteristics of this class, it's totally degenerated, totally degenerated. And those ones who join them, approach them, but the reformists and so on are going to degenerate together with them. So more and more you need to build the class unit, the unity among the oppressed, the marginalized, the working class to build a way out. I don't see another way out. And that must be international, more than ever international. Through any kind, like Malcolm X said, by any means necessary. You can use any means necessary, but you have to have one way to do that. Class independency and a revolutionary perspective. As that we are living in a world, unfortunately, the majority of problems here in Brazil there is a crisis of leadership for the working class. And here in Brazil, we have the majority of the organizations, the entities, the parties, and even the program that we built in years and years of struggle now are being totally degenerated by the perspective of the majority of the labor union in Brazil right now. The social movement support government has as a vice president, Lula's vice president, was the governor of São Paulo, and it was under his government that he created here in São Paulo a huge coalition of movements in 2012 that was called the Committee Against the Genocide of Black People. And you said by that time, the most responsible for the genocide of Black young people in São Paulo was Alckmin, who is Lula's vice president. So we cannot, because of that, you have a very difficult problem in face of us. But I also, like Colo said, I get out of optimist of this meeting because there's an example that you can build in some way, some international perspective, work together and find a way out together. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Comrade. Fiona?
Yeah, I also just want to say thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thanks to Workers' Voice for hosting, and it's been incredible to learn from Sankara and Colo and Wilson tonight. Yeah, I hope to see some people in Atlanta in the next week or so. I hope to continue building eco-socialism together, and it all boils down to solidarity.
Thanks, Fiona. Let us know when you're down here. We'll get you into the forest. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your wonderful questions and comments, and thank you to our panelists for their wonderful interventions and presentations, and for their time. I hope that everyone comes out of here with a little bit of knowledge of how we can play a small role in the movement to stop Cop City. And I encourage everyone to take a look at the websites that have been mentioned here tonight: StopReevesYoung.com, StopCopCitySolidarity.org, DefendTheAtlantaForest.org, and ATLPressCollective.com, which are all great sources for information, and news and updates on the movement. Let's work together, build this movement, and let's stop Cop City.
Great.